Lesson 4. The Southern Colonies. It matters because a warm climate, long growing season, and rich soil spurred the growth of large-scale agriculture in the Southern Colonies. Virginia and Maryland. Guiding question. What problems faced Maryland and Virginia? The settlement of Jamestown marked the beginning of English colonization in North America and of the Virginia colony. After its difficult beginnings, Virginia began to grow. The demand for workers was high. It took a great deal of labor to plant, tend, and harvest the tobacco crop on which the colony depended. White landowners helped meet this need through the use of enslaved Africans. The first group of 20 Africans arrived in 1619 aboard a Dutch trading vessel. In the years to follow, many more shiploads of this human cargo would arrive in North America. You will learn more about this terrible trade in enslaved Africans in other chapters. The story of Virginia's first Africans shows that not all people came to work in the colonies of their own free will. England also shipped criminals and prisoners of war to the colonies. They could earn their release by working for a period of time, usually 7 years. Many people also came to the colonies as indentured servants. To pay for their passage to America, they agreed to work without pay for a certain length of time. Founding Maryland. Maryland arose from the dream of Sir George Calvert, Lord Baltimore. Calvert wanted a safe place for his fellow Catholics who faced persecution in England. England's king, Charles I, gave Calvert a proprietary colony north of Virginia. Soon after receiving this grant, Calvert died. His son, Cecilius, inherited the colony and named it Maryland. Cecilius sent 2 of his brothers to start the colony. They reached America in 1634. Cecilius gave large estates to English aristocrats. He also granted smaller pieces of land to other settlers. As the number of plantations grew, so did the need for workers. The colony imported indentured servants and enslaved Africans. For years, the Calvert and Penn families argued over the boundary between Maryland and Pennsylvania. In the 1760s, they hired 2 men named Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon to map the boundary between the colonies. This boundary line became known as the Mason-Dixon line. Religion was another source of conflict. The Calverts welcomed Protestants as well as Catholics. Protestant settlers outnumbered Catholics. To protect Catholics, the colony established the Act of Toleration in 1649. The act ensured Protestants and Catholics the right to worship freely. Tensions, however, continued. In 1692, Maryland, now a royal colony, established an official Protestant church. As a result, Catholics faced the same restrictions they had in England. Rebellion in Virginia. Virginia also experienced conflict. As the colony grew, settlers moved west and onto Native American lands. In the 1640s, Virginia Governor William Berkeley made a pledge to Native Americans. In exchange for a large piece of land, he agreed to keep settlers from pushing farther into their territory. Berkeley's goal was to prevent the outbreak of a war with the Native Americans. Nathaniel Bacon was a young planter in western Virginia. He opposed the colonial government because it was dominated by Easterners. Many Westerners also resented Berkeley's pledge to stay out of Native American territory. Some settled in the forbidden areas. They then blamed the government for not clearing the colony of Native Americans. In 1676, Bacon led attacks on Native American villages. His army also marched to Jamestown to drive out Berkeley, and they burned the town to the ground. Bacon seemed on the verge of taking over the colony when he suddenly became ill and died. With his death, the rebellion faded. England recalled Berkeley and sent troops to restore order. Bacon's rebellion showed that government could not ignore the demands of its people. The Carolinas and Georgia. Guiding question: what factors contributed to the growth of the Carolinas? In 1663, King Charles II created a proprietary colony south of Virginia called Carolina, Latin for Charles's land. The king gave the colony to 8 nobles. The proprietors set up estates and sold or rented land to settlers brought from England. John Locke, an English philosopher, wrote a constitution, a plan that outlined the jobs and powers of the colony's government. The Constitution covered topics such as land divisions and social rank. Locke stated, "Every man has a property in his own person. The labor of his body and the work of his hands are properly his." 2 Carolinas. Carolina did not develop as planned. It split into northern and southern Carolina. Farmers from inland Virginia settled northern Carolina. They grew tobacco and sold timber and tar. Northern Carolina lacked a good harbor, so farmers used Virginia's ports. Settlers in southern Carolina took advantage of fertile land and the harbor at Charlestown, later Charleston. Settlements there spread, and trade in deerskin, lumber, and beef thrived. 2 crops came to dominate Carolina agriculture. In the 1680s, planters discovered that rice grew well in the wet coastal lowlands. Growing rice required much labor, and the demand for slave labor rose. Another important crop was indigo. A young English woman named Eliza Lucas developed this crop in the 1740s. Indigo, a blue flowering plant, was used to dye cloth. By the early 1700s, Carolina settlers were growing tired of proprietor rule. In 1719, settlers in southern Carolina took control from the proprietors. In 1729, Carolina became 2 royal colonies, North Carolina and South Carolina. Georgia. Georgia, founded in 1733, was the last British colony set up in America. James Oglethorpe received a charter from George II for a colony where debtors and poor people could make a fresh start. In Britain, debtors, those who had debts, could be imprisoned if they were unable to pay what they owed. The British also hoped Georgia would block any Spanish attack on the colonies from Florida. Oglethorpe and his settlers built the forts and town of Savannah to discourage such attacks. Georgia did not develop as Oglethorpe planned. Hundreds of poor people came from Britain, but few debtors settled there. Religious refugees from Central Europe and a small group of Jews also arrived. Many settlers complained about Oglethorpe's rules, especially the limits on landholding and the bans on slave labor and rum. A frustrated Oglethorpe finally agreed to their demands. Disappointed with the colony's slow growth, he gave up and turned Georgia over to the king in 1751. By that time, the British had been in eastern North America for almost 150 years. They had lined the Atlantic coast with colonies.